It was inherently an information operation that mobilized weaponized disgust, redirected rage from, a certain class of individuals, and marketed rebellion against the system, but it all had electoral goals.
Were the Epstein files just one big PSYOP? My name is James Lee, and you're watching Beyond the Headlines on Breaking Points. You've probably heard by now, the Department of Justice has officially closed the book on Jeffrey Epstein. No client list, no blackmail operation, just a quiet memo saying the files are sealed to protect victims and that no further investigation is necessary. For years, the Epstein case has been treated as the holy grail of anti-elite accountability. It was a rallying cry, not just for conspiracy theorists and internet sleuths, but for the millions of Americans who believe that maybe, just maybe, there was an administration who could finally take on the so-called deep state. But now, in the absence of any real justice or transparency, we're left with a disturbing question. Was the Epstein narrative ever meant to deliver justice, or was it designed to hijack public outrage and funnel it into something else entirely? To help us unpack all of this, we're joined today by Greg Stoker. He is a former Army Ranger and intelligence specialist who served 4 combat tours in Afghanistan. He is now an anti-war activist and a geopolitical analyst over at Mint Press News, and also host of the Colonial Outcast podcast. Greg, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so I want to start first. There's a bunch of things I want to get into with you today, but I want to start with your Mint Press piece because I thought it was really well articulated in that you argue that the Epstein saga was never really meant to deliver justice, that it was a kind of a managed psyop from the start. So I want to kind of press on that a little bit. Was there ever, you think, a genuine plan for accountability that was maybe later co-opted by, let's say, intelligence agencies or foreign interests like Israel, maybe internal power struggles, or was the whole thing, like you said, engineered from day one as political theater, kind of?
I don't think it was engineered. If we look back to the core of what binds the, I guess, right-wing conservative culture war, it came organically. It came from a number of different places. There was some insanity happening with QAnon. But if you look at all these policies, all these culture wars that they're waging, the one core nucleus that they're all bound by is this narrative about protecting children, right? So you have the pro-life movement protecting children, the can't have drag queens reading to kids, protecting children, anti-trans legislation, genital mutilation that they have no control over, protecting children. And then this was born out of anti-democrat, elite democratic establishment, which of course a lot of people were disillusioned with, to be pedophilic sex traffickers. Protecting children is also bound up with the anti-Hollywood woke agenda as well. So it was all tied into this massive kind of thought space that existed, and then it was exploited. Or, and of course it was led by, think tanks like the Heritage Foundation and other groups as well. But this was the core of it. The crux of it, the marrow of the entire thing was the promise of the Epstein files being released. And there's a bombshell finally that there would be some accountability for these establishment Dems and, Hollywood glitterati who are running these child sex trafficking rings, pushing the woke agenda. But this was never about justice, right? And it's definitely not about transparency in terms of governmental operations. It was basically this lure for the drain the swamp conservatives that emerged, I think, organically, but was co-opted and intentionally crafted as a psyop born out of, again, multiple movements to radicalize a disillusioned, overly online generation and nudge them towards MAGA as the only faction fighting the elite. And, it kind of worked, right? Because now Trump's own DOJ, as you said, in your introduction, quietly admits no Epstein client list, no blackmail operation, no murder. I just saw your video about the 11 hours of tape that were supposed to prove that nothing happened. It was just suicide. Hey, guys, case closed. So what was all the outrage for? Well, to get folks to vote Republican and feel like they were fighting the system composed of like these CIA, FBI crypt keepers that have been around since the Bay of Pigs and career bureaucrats and pedophilic establishment Dems And it was inherently an information operation that mobilized weaponized disgust, redirected rage from, a certain class of individuals, and marketed rebellion against the system, but it all had electoral um, goals, electoral purposes.
So I do think this is going to be kind of a bellwether test of whether or not Trump can get away with more stuff. Because if you think about this issue, like you said, it has really driven the MAGA base, and they really want. I think a lot of people genuinely wanted to see accountability on both sides, and I think they understood that both parties were kind of in on the take here. There's corruption on both sides. I'm kind of seeing a split now online reaction of a lot of people being upset. Also, someone on the other side saying that, well, Trump, he really wanted to expose this network, but he was somehow outgunned when he got in the White House and he didn't really know what he was dealing with. So do you think there's any validity in that argument? Or did Trump, he made many promises before getting into office. So was that all just, like you said, as a cynical ploy to get votes? Or did he really think that he could just release the files and then he got in there and found things that, wow, I didn't want this to get out?
Well, I don't really talk on my own platforms about like conspiracy theories because, the performative effect is all the same, whether or not he's in the Epstein files, whether or not like, people like such high profile people are in the Epstein files that would cause like massive market instability and collapse and stuff like that. It doesn't matter because now that the Epstein narrative has served its purpose, whether or not it's true or not, they'll find something else. It was to like sheepdog voters into voting for this. And what's the next like narrative going to be? Likely Iranian sleeper cells, terrorists to conflate criminal migrants to justify more ICE crackdowns. But yeah, it's basically played out now. And what you're referring to, this kind of discussion on the right, what I would caution people to be like, yes, this is finally when we're going to experience like this massive ideological fragmentation within MAGA. Well, I don't know. I was watching Steve Bannon's War Room Monday to see if he'd comment about this, but no, he opened up with the son of Bolsonaro in an interview and then shifted to the JFK assassination. So a lot of MAGA thought leaders and influencers aren't responding to it. A lot of them were shocked for the first couple days and then towed the information line. So I don't know. We've seen like historically since the beginning of his administration, I'm going to end the war to Ukraine. He couldn't do that. Everyone with like the most basic 101 geopolitical savvy knew that that was not possible. And then recently, the Department of Defense says, "Hey, we're stopping arms shipments to Ukraine." Oh, but now at the White House dinner Monday night with Netanyahu, he says they were going to restore them. Obviously, the promise to bring peace to Iran is not going to happen. Ending the ceasefire in Gaza, probably not going to happen because all of this is basically just playing for time. They're trying to play for time while they loot, pillage the government, and they're trying to manage information and give political cover to certain actions. And my analogy that I always use is they're operating like a corporation because that's basically what the U.S. government is now. They're trying to maximize shareholder returns every quarter, and they're only thinking to the next quarter. Let's just get there. We're stringing out the Gaza ceasefire negotiations, even though, the last time there was a ceasefire, they broke it 250 times before Israel ended it. So if there's a new ceasefire, there's still going to be violence. But it's all to just give political cover, just like the big beautiful bill. The tax cuts for the ultra rich are going to take effect before the tax cuts to Medicare, which look like they're going to take effect after the midterms in 2026, when all these Republicans have already voted, so they weren't actually affected in the same way that they would be, if it took effect before. And in the meantime, because I don't think they're going to have such a powerful like narrative again after this Epstein thing, that they're just going to double down on force now that the mask is off and we can actually see what we're doing. So we're seeing like the escalation of ICE, not just in terms of legislation and budget allocations, but in terms of actual presence on the ground. One of the border chiefs this morning on Fox News said like, people better get used to it because, quote, this is the new normal. And so now that the mask is off and they're not even trying to really play damage control or do any sort of like sophisticated PR messaging around the Epstein files. They're just like, hey, now it's done. Move on. By the way, here's our stretch goal for 100,000 more like paramilitary officers.
Right. Well, yeah, I heard Trump, I think this morning, talk about Epstein. And he said, well, why are we still talking about this? It's been so many years. Let's move on. Let's move past this. So to that point, What do you think is coming up next? You've alluded to some of these things like ICE, maybe, combine that with the Palantir database situation. I do find a lot of this messaging to be quite congruent, if I may use that word, in that
Mhm.
there is something going on. I know Americans are feeling, hey, there's something not quite right with this country. There's situations, there's things happening everywhere, things people are not able to live, and the Republicans have kind of framed this as, well, we have these situations at the border, we have whatever else is going on, and what we're trying to do with all of these things is make America safer. And that's like, I think, a message that's like ringing true. It's like, okay, all this stuff, we're going to put up with it because it's going to, quote unquote, make the country safer. But then when I'm looking at it from, the lens of, let's say, national security, the surveillance state, these kinds of things, I can't quite shake the feeling that some of this is probably about, silencing political dissidents. When they say, when they open up the Alligator Alcatraz facility, they say that's going to be for illegal immigrants, illegal migrants, things like that. I can't help it but think of maybe some people went up there who's, criticizing Israel or something like that. So what are your thoughts around all of this? What can we expect in the next 3.5 years here with the Trump administration?
All right. Well, look, things aren't going to look exactly like they looked in the 1930s for a lot of complicated historical reasons, but we are seeing like that history is kind of like rhyming now with this crackdown. We're seeing that first they came for like the trans rights, the trans folks and the migrants, and now they're moving on to naturalized citizens. There's a legislative push to denaturalize people, which of course Obama really expanded. By the way, this is like they're building a ladder. Both the establishment Democrats and the Republicans who have the same donors and serve the same interests. But they're trying to expand it now to include people that are, quote, national security threats. And over the past 2 years, we've seen Marco Rubio take away student visas on the grounds of national security. We've seen, them trying to levy terrorism charges against protesters in the Palestine movement. And they're also, designated MS-13 and some gangs in Mexico as foreign terrorist organizations. So we're seeing this melding, this conflation of anyone who talks bad about U.S. foreign policy and U.S. violent domestic foreign policy is kind of like an enemy of the state. And I I get called dramatic a lot, but then again, one of my favorite proverbs is, the road to fascism is paved by people telling you you're overreacting. So as someone with a background in the military, there's supposed to be a massive separation of even National Guard forces and federal and local law enforcement. Like during the Black Lives Matter protests, I live in Austin, the National Guard came up and they're just like, hey man, we're going to be down the street like 4 blocks. We don't want anything to do with this. Like if you need us, we'll be there. And there was still this separation. They weren't pulling security for federal law enforcement because that's what just happened in MacArthur Park this past Monday. The National Guard were sent in to pull security so protesters didn't impede the work of federal ICE agents. And there's also like IRS and DEA and ATF on the ground as well. So we haven't seen that kind of melding of what we could call military and paramilitary forces. And basically it's just this normalization where they've got the Marines deployed to LA, you've got the Marines deployed and the National Guard deployed to Alligator Alcatraz for quote unquote logistical purposes, but it's not going to end with logistical purposes. This is only going to escalate. They're just trying to normalize it one step at a time, just like we're only going after the criminals. No, we're actually going after all the illegals. And oh no, we're not going after citizens unless you're naturalized. And this is just going to keep going up and up and up.
So I wanted to ask you about the Democrats because you brought them up a couple times. They don't seem to be offering any kind of real resistance to this surveillance, prison, military, industrial state that seems to be proliferating. In fact, I think they might even be in on it. What does resistance actually look like to you in this situation? It doesn't seem like they're offering any kind of solution. Do you think any part of it still requires sort of a grassroots reaching out to the other side, maybe building a coalition with parts of the MAGA base who are genuinely disillusioned with elite power? Because I've had a lot of conversation with the folks, and they're not happy about this. I don't know if they know where to go because it seems like there's kind of a vacuum here in terms of at least from the top down. So what does that look like to you? Where are you at with all this?
Okay, so with the Democrats, they're not necessarily as complicit as the Republicans in this new push to create like labor prisons. If you look at like the the GEO group and like Core Civic, these the two massive prison industrial corporations, you know, they're overwhelmingly contributing to Republican candidates. You know, on a scale that like APAC or the defense industry, which is usually bipartisan, does. No, they're actually more on the conservative lobbying base. However, again, Democrats really historically and liberals within a more global context don't really exist to defeat like far right parties necessarily. What they're best at historically and what they're best at right now is blocking actual progressive movements from access to political power. So the Democrats, yeah, they might not be as in on the prison industrial complex aspect of it, but of course they always historically have expanded it administration after administration. In 2005, 25% of the detained ICE detainees were in private prisons. Obama expanded it under Joe Biden. It got up to 90%. So, but I think by now, and hopefully people within like the liberal establishment or the liberal sphere will start to realize that they're not, if they can't even endorse Mamdani, you know, who is their candidate being vote blue no matter who, they're not really going to put up any resistance.
Yeah, the Mandami situation, I wasn't going to get into this with you today, but it's an interesting, I think, observation that I've had around it is that he seems to be getting hate from both sides, from the Democrats who don't really want his candidacy. Like you said, they're trying to maybe eke out or they're trying to keep the progressives from gaining power. The Republicans are saying that he's Muslim, he's going to bring about all this, Sharia law and all this kind of stuff. It seems like both sides are kind of coalescing in that. And I do find it to be quite, because I don't actually agree with Mandani on everything, but I do think that he represents something potentially real as far as like, hey, nobody wanted him in power. He went and campaigned and he built a coalition to deliver him victory electorally. And now it seems like both parties don't want that. They're trying to deport him or find ways to keep him from getting power. And I guess the question that I kind of want to shoehorn in here is that I'm curious about your background a little bit in that you've been inside the system, your intelligence work, special ops, 4 tours in Afghanistan. So if you don't mind sharing, like, what was the moment that you realized, hey, something is off with the American political system, whether it be the Imperial Project or something going on at home? Was there anything that like flipped a switch for you?
Oh yeah, this is actually a good question because it applies right now. So for me, the thing that radicalized me into the radical position of being like, hey, let's stop doing these forever wars, because apparently that makes you crazy. But it was yeah, 4 combat deployments. I started off in an assault role in the 75th Ranger Regiment, which was like direct action night raids against like Taliban or Al Qaeda Haqqani targets and proto Islamic State stuff. And then I shifted over to a more like human intelligence collection role, which started with like asking questions on the ground and then expanded more into analysis. But when you start getting plugged into the actual intelligence cycle, it's like we really didn't have a lot of actionable things to go off of. And they're like, well, go anyways. You know, we need this amount of like special operations missions. We need this amount of drone strikes. We got to keep up the quote unquote operational intensity. So if you take that experience, port it over to ICE, who are wrapping up nobody, they have no intelligence to go off of. They're just doing the exact same thing. And so when we say that fascism is imperialism turned in on itself, it's like, dude, I get what these guys are going through. Not that I would ever join up to be an ICE officer, but like they have nothing to go off of, and they have these orders: more people, more mass deportations. Just like the goal in Iraq and Afghanistan wasn't to win the wars; it was to make a lot of money and have endless wars. Well, what we no longer have that kind of power projection, and we can't do that anymore. But what we can do is wage a forever civilian war in our own territory, and that's what's most concerning to me because I'm seeing a lot of uncomfortable patterns emerge.
Wow. Okay. So yeah, that's a really interesting analogy. Is that we're not able to project the type of power overseas, so we are going to just turn it in domestically to keep this kind of military industrial complex going. I think you've given us, I think, a lot to think about. Certainly, maybe challenging my own personal view on a few things. So, do you want to let people know where they can follow you to get more of your content?
Yeah, guys. I'm on social media, greg.j.stoker, pretty much on all platforms. I host for myself the Colonial Outcast podcast, the anti-imperialist podcast that your uncle will hate, and then I have a show twice a week called State of Play on Mint Press News. So, thank you.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for joining the show today, Greg. And hopefully talk to you again soon.
Cheers.
That is it for me this week. If you want more stories that the mainstream media is unwilling to cover, you can head on over to my YouTube channel, 5149 with James Lee. The link will be in the description below. And as always, thank you so much for your time today and keep on tuning into Breaking Points.